I am I am joined here by some wonderful individuals who I'm going to ask if they can please introduce themselves. Ellie, Courtney, Paul, do you want to say hello and share your role?
Hello, everyone. I'm Courtney. I am the Associate Director of Business and Partnership Developments, which is just a title of, I don't know how many of y'all have it, that I do all the things that people need for the Bright team. So I'm the individual that helps out where I can, come in with a background where I serve as, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And I've also taught a little bit within education. And I tell everyone I'm the daughter of an educator. And so have been in schools my entire life. Almost as if it's my second home. So I'm Courtney, and I'll throw it to my colleague, Paul, Paul, then you can throw it to Ellie.
Great. Hi, everyone. Paul Hyrie-Dermuth, incredibly blessed to be Courtney's teammate in Bright, and also to be part of the Thriving Minds initiative together with John and Ellie and other partners in at the Rennie Center and MAS MHC. And yeah, just really pleased to be with you today and to have the chance to learn from and with John and Courtney, who will be leading this session. Ellie.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Ellie Sanchez, and I'm an associate with the Rennie Center, which is also a part of Thriving Minds with these wonderful, wonderful folks. And I'm also the person that's snagging you on email all the time. So I'm sorry about that, especially at this moment, but I'm glad that I'm able to give you the information that you need, logistically at least, and to partner with all of these. It's great, all of these folks. It's great to see everyone. Thank you for being here.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. So a little bit about this series and also about Thriving Minds. So Thriving Minds is a collaboration between Bright out of Brookline Center. So for those of you who are familiar with Bright, you know how awesome they are. Really focused on designing programming such that we are supporting students returning from long-term absence, psychiatric hospitalization. They're the best in the land at doing that, and they do an awful lot of other stuff too. But I think you know, many of you may have Bright or Bridge programs in your school or district. So thrilled that they're part of the team. Rennie Center is represented on this team as well, and they have been fantastic partners. And I represent the Massachusetts School Mental Health Consortium. So we're coming together to provide a series on trauma responsive or trauma informed or healing centered practices, systems, so that we can really improve our ability to support kids who have experienced trauma and also not re-traumatize our kids, because unfortunately sometimes we do that, and we need to understand the systems and practices that will support us not doing that. So the series is funded in partnership with the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma. It's a new center, and we are thrilled to be able to partner with them to be able to make this a thing, to be able to be here today and provide this opportunity for professional development and learning. Here's a little bit of info on the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma. We thank you. OCA thanks you. UMass thanks you. So again, great that we're able to make this happen as a function of that funding. So with that being said, we're going to talk about trauma today. We want to dispel some myths about trauma. We want to give you some really strong information about what it really is. I think probably all of you have some semblance of an understanding about what trauma is. You've certainly heard it. You know, you've heard about what trauma is. Some of you may feel expert in understanding it. Some of you may feel like you're a little bit like, yeah, I know what it means, sorta. I kind of get it. We want to help you to get it all the way, and so that we can operate from a standpoint where we have a very clear and strong understanding of what it means when we say trauma and our students' experience of trauma. So we're going to define it. We're going to talk about the prevalence of trauma. And I think this is unfortunately, you know, a piece of the conversation that is alarming for some people. I think some people are not aware of the degree to which trauma or potential trauma events have occurred with our kids. We want to talk about the cause of trauma. We're going to get a little bit into the weeds, but we won't go too far into the literature. in terms of the stress response system. We want to talk about why knowledge about the systems to address trauma is particularly important for schools. You know, you are the forward-facing support for kids for much of their life. And that means that we have to be super ready to be able to provide care in a trauma responsive way. And I'll say that this is one of the key questions, one of the foundational questions of this work. Without knowing which students have experienced trauma, how can a school account for and create a culture that is sensitive to trauma and actively seek to avoid re-traumatization? That is essential because you don't know your kid's trauma history, right? It's not something that they come to the table with. You don't get a little file on every kid and you're like, oh, well, I'll make sure to account for that. So we want to help you to understand ways in which you don't actually even need that information to create an environment that is trauma sensitive. So far, are you with me? Thumbs up? All right, I love that. You're just like so responsive. It makes me feel good. So that being said, I realize we don't have a slide in here for this, but I think we should probably have a call out in the chat. Where are you from? What's your role? If you don't mind typing in the chat real quick, I would really appreciate that. It's also going to get you used to using the keyboard. We are going to be asking lots of questions. We want you to be engaged. You will notice also that Zoom has a feature where you can unmute yourself. We encourage you to do so. We want to hear from you. It's going to do no one any good if it's just us talking. Look at this. We've got Assistant Superintendent Revere, Danielle, welcome. Amherst, Program Director at Collaborative, awesome. Worcester Public, great. Madison Clifford, welcome. Karen, good to see you, Karen. Good to see you, Kevin. It's been a little bit. Tara, awesome. So we've got a good representation here. Love this. All of you are proficient with the keyboard. Gardner's here, Winchendon's here, love it. Okay, so let's keep that keyboard handy. Let's also keep that mute button handy. Keep introducing yourselves in the chat. And we've got an opening activity for you. So we're gonna start with these questions. I'm gonna ask you to please come off mute and share. I also want you to type in the chat if you want to, but let's start with some inquiry. Let's start with, how do you understand students' behavior? Basically the why. Why do they do certain things? How do we ultimately understand student behavior? What are the typical ways in which you do that? What do you think? Data collection. Thank you, Jillian. First on the board, Jillian gets 100 points. Behaviors communication. Tara, thank you. Yes. I want to highlight Tara for a moment. Behavior is a form of communication. It's saying something. We have to figure out what it's saying. Yep, communication, observation. Love it. Very cool. So one of the key pieces for this session, and for really all the sessions on trauma, is going to be understanding that students' behavior has some form or function. It is communicating something. Sometimes it is communicating need. Sometimes it is communicating distress. Sometimes it is communicating that they want to be off task. That's true too, right? Like sometimes behavior is learned behavior. Sometimes it is volitional. But one of the key elements that we want to communicate today is that there is a difference between volitional behavior and stress response. Remember that, that's key. You could sign off right now and you will have gained something from this session, but don't, there's more to come. How about this? What's your understanding of trauma? What is trauma? What do you think? Before we get into the definition, how would you define it? Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate you introducing. How do we define trauma? First person to come off mute gets $1,000.
Done. I think trauma is dependent on how the person experiences it. So something that is traumatic for somebody might not be traumatic for somebody else.
I think it's a great point, because sometimes we label events as traumatic events, but they don't have the lasting adverse effect, so that we can't actually label it trauma. It's uncomfortable, it's unfortunate, it's potentially damaging, but it's not trauma. So we're going to get to that distinction for sure. I appreciate that, Erin. Kevin's got your check, so just go to him. He's in Springfield. Okay. Why does or should this matter to you as an educator? What should you be responsible for addressing the needs of kids relative to trauma? Megan, love that. Event or experience that can cause adverse effects. Thank you for that in the chat. Awesome. These are good call outs in the chat. Appreciate that. Kendra, impacts ability to learn or availability to learn. Gotcha. Thank you, Kendra. Yeah, I think, you know, if we don't account for students' trauma or their well-being first, how can we expect them to engage in high-level academics? Not going to happen, right? Well-being before academics, at the risk of being incredibly trite and played out Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, but it just happens to be true too. Why does it matter? Because it may impact ability to make new relationships. Thank you for that, Kimberly. Any event that impacts an individual's well-being. Renee, I think you're going with like the definition of trauma. Thank you for offering that. Impacts long-term health, social, emotional health. Yep. Shapes behavior and responses to abilities. This is all good stuff. So, yeah, Jillian, because you carry it with you forever. Agreed. Well played. So I think we're primed for the discussion. Yeah, we're talking about, I want you to be ready to talk about the function of behavior. I want you to be ready to talk about what trauma is, how much it happens, why it happens, and what the impact is on all outcomes, and why it matters, why you are the front line for these kids, because no one else coming to the table for this. This is us. No one else is going to address the needs of kids in school relative to trauma except you. Cool? We ready to keep going? You good? Thumbs up? You with me? Okay. This is where I turn it over to Courtney, and I'm quiet for a while.
Just for a little while, I'm going to do what I would call a high-level overview of a lot of the concepts that you all just talked about or hinted at in the responses to the questions that John asked. And so one of the things is all about like where you might be like, well, why does this trauma-informed, healing-centered approach, why does it even matter, right? And so the number one thing we wanted to get you all to say is because people's behavior tells us something, right? And so one of the things that we always talk about is how do you shift from like, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? To what happened to you? And then to what can I do to help you? Right. And so those are the questions that we want you all to constantly be asking as we introduce is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you and what can I do to help you, right? The other thing we talk about is there can be big T's and there can be little T's, and those little T's, we call them little traumas, like small things, can add up to have a traumatic impact on someone's life, especially if it's repetitive and it's happening over and over again, right? And so one of the things you all see is I tell anyone, if you look at the diagram, you can see when there is a person's brain. If we think about when our brain lights up, that's when our thinking is lighting up. That's when we're functioning. That's when we're on all fours. If we're stressed and depressed, our brain doesn't light up. A kid's brain doesn't light up. You know, trauma decreases the ability to do that. And so there's a difference between someone who's stressed and depressed and dealing with the effects of trauma and someone who's functioning at an optimal level. We want to get everyone to their optimal level, so we have to help them build their resilience. And then so with that in mind, I think the thing that I just want to remind you all of, John, next slide, is that the brain, and this is taken from the book What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry, one of my favorite books. I think if you've seen me before, you know I talk about Bruce Perry all the time, partly because his stuff just makes so much sense for me. And so one of the things that is just, I want you all to look at this, and he says that the brain is organized almost like a funnel, right? And with the funnel, the thing we have to remember is that everything is processed from the bottom up. you don't start with the thinking and then go down into temperature, respiratory functioning, and cardiac. You start in your body and you go up to the thinking part of yourself. And so it just wants to, and this is just then to remind you all, again, all experiences process from the bottom up, which means we feel before we think. We act before we think. And so one of the things we have to be attuned, this is going to be really hard for individuals who've experienced trauma and are struggling to regulate, to access the upper portions of their brain and to do the long-term thinking. And as you all said, to be present in the classroom. They're just not ready to get there because I can't regulate myself because my basic needs at the bottom of my stem haven't been met. And so one of the things that we're going to continue to see, and that's important, and Gary put a question in the chat. Yes, and John's going to talk about that. Totally, it activates fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. It activates all of them, right? And it depends on where the person is within the scale of trauma, that what it decides to activate, right? And I'm going to talk about that more in a minute because I'm actually going to show you a diagram. And so one of the things in the next slide that it just talks about is that we're built to experience stress, right? And stress is something it's important. We can't live without it. The problem is, particularly with trauma, is that the stress becomes less, it's not dosage, it's just all in, right? And so how do we begin to recognize that it's just all in? And John, can you show the next slide for me? And so that's the piece where we say, it's not about, we don't want anyone to have any stress. Is that we want to begin to make it predictable, moderate, and controllable. And that's how we build resilience. Because with trauma, when I think about it's unpredictable, it's extreme, it's prolonged, and they're sensitized to it. And it becomes, when you've experienced something traumatic, you don't feel like you have control over anything. And everything feels out of your control. And so how do you begin to help them see and dosage the amount of stress and to focus on that sphere of control versus the sphere of concern? Right. And so those are the things that we really want to do, because one of the things when working with trauma is we have to build resilience, because otherwise they continue to live a life that's completely sensitized to everything around them. And on the next slide, you will see that this is where it kind of lays out the fight, flight, fawn, and freeze that you were talking about, where it shows what happens when we're calm and alert and like our adaptive responses to it, right? And one of the things is, I just want you all to look at what happens to our functional IQ as we go from calm to terror, as we go from calm to fight. My IQ goes down. Your cognition goes down. Right? You're no longer able to be creative. You're no longer able to lean in. And also you're no longer able to have visions about the future being different. If hope is a discipline, you don't have any of that discipline. And it becomes really hard to live into it. And so one of the things and here's another diagram that really shows you all the importance of it on the next slide, is this idea, that look, when I'm calm, I have access to 85% of my thinking self. When I'm dysregulated and I'm stuck, I only have 5% access to my thinking self. And I'm hesitant to form a relationship. Look at the 30%. Limbic system is functioning. I'm ready to relate and connect with the world. When I'm stuck in this fight, freeze, fawn, and I'm dysregulated, I don't want to connect. Even though connection is the thing that will help me heal. And so how do we make it okay for that? Becomes really important. And in the next slide, it's just an example that a lot of times with kids, they're dysregulated. We try to communicate with them and tell them, if you do this, this is going to cause this, and this is what's going to happen to you. And we want you to rethink and think about the 4 R's, where it starts at the bottom. We got to help them regulate. Then we form the relationship. Then we get to the reflect and reason. So basically, how are we asking, where are we starting? Trauma informed means I acknowledge that you are not regulated. So I'm not going to ask you to access the upper portions of your brain and really begin to think about, well, if you do this, here's what's going to happen. If you do that, or starting with, I'm actually going to start with, can I help you breathe a little bit? gonna work on sensory stuff with you, right? Because I'm gonna recognize that my ability to connect with you and for you to get where you need to be depends on me meeting you where you are in your brain and your body. And so that makes it becomes really important. And so again, this slide just emphasizes the same thing, that, you know, the 4 R's, where are we with the 4 R's on the next slide? And again, I can't emphasize it enough. John's going to talk about it more. It's like, we can't get to reasoning, which is up top, until we get to regulating, right? And trauma-informed healing experiences means, look, there's a mind and body connection, right? Coping skills are important. How are we helping implement them, right? How are we teaching them? How are they becoming a part of just the functioning of the system within our schools, right? Can we acknowledge that there is a psychological and emotional impact on everyone that's entering the building, from the kids to the adults? Because we also want to acknowledge that a dysregulated adult is going to struggle to regulate a dysregulated kid. So there's some adults that are also coming with trauma. So this is our why for being here. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our how, and I'm going to turn over to John. He's going to give you more details. So one of the questions we asked you all is just, what is trauma, right? And so the DSM-5 has all these words that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but the biggest thing is trauma just is when someone's ability to cope is overwhelmed. I have no resources to access to deal with this, none. And so that's how it can be different for each individual, because we're coming with a different level of resources. We're each coming with a different toolkit to approach life. And so what's traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for others, because I have something in my toolkit to help me deal with it. But trauma, it's one person, I'm overwhelmed. I don't know how to deal with this. My body doesn't know how to deal with this. What's happening right now, right? And so that's how the DSM-5 defines trauma. Now, if we move forward and we think about how else can we define trauma? And the other way trauma is defined is through the 3 E's, you know, with SAMHSA, where they says, you know what, there's been an event or a series of events, someone's experienced it. And as you all said, it's had lasting adverse effects. And that lasting adverse effects, it goes on. You know, one of the things I tell anyone is like, look, people can survive the crisis. It's the everyday living that's hard. And so that's that lasting effects piece, right? So you have the event, you have an experience, and then you have the lasting effects of that. And so what are the different types of trauma? You all got at some of them. And so this is a slide that just shows, you know, they're everywhere. You know, community violence, racial violence, domestic violence, natural disasters, even medical trauma, right? Like getting diagnosed with a chronic illness, you know, grief, injury, physical abuse, refugees, family, right? So how all of these are types of trauma that people experience. And I don't want us to neglect one that we continue to see the effects of, which is a global pandemic, right? That's happening to us. And you all, on the next slide, you all mentioned that you learned a lot about the ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, adverse community environments. And I was listening to a podcast and said, can we look at this and can we need to find a way to put on here adverse COVID experiences, right? That's another ACEs. So can someone blow this out and redo this, where we have adverse childhood experience, adverse community environments, and add adverse COVID experiences, and what that has done? Because as you all will see on the next slide, we really believe COVID is a slow-moving trauma, a collective slow-moving trauma, and we don't know what the implications are going to be for this long-term or short-term. I tell anyone, my niece is like, Auntie, I lost a year of my life because of COVID. She's like, my life just ended. I didn't connect with nobody. I couldn't make no friends. She's like, my life was over. It was just depressing for a whole year. And so we don't know what that means, right? For identity development, we don't know what that means for language, for connections. We don't know. And a lot of people, and it feels like it's still going, and it's over. A lot of people have just shut down. I know a lot of people say, we're all experiencing a sense of timelessness. Where are the time markers? Do you remember what happened from day? Somebody tells you did, so you're like, wait, when did I do that? right? Like there's this sense of collectiveness. And like I said, we don't know what the implications are. And this hasn't been, like predictable. It hasn't been moderate and it hasn't been controlled. And we're still sitting with it. And so what does that mean? And how do we continue to embrace an environment that acknowledges this? Because right now, one of the things we're seeing is just, if we think about what's happened to kids since COVID, on the slide, you'll see some statistics that just talk about some things that you all are probably familiar with. But the percentage of visits for mental health reasons to emergency departments are through the roof for kids. And then there are not enough beds there. So kids are staying in the ED with adults for 3 to 4 weeks before they can get appropriate placements. 1 in 4 kids are saying they've considered suicide. And much like my niece, all of them are saying they feel isolated and disengaged. Like they're not feeling like there's anybody there that is there that's taking care of them, that they have a crew, or someone would say that they have a tribe of their people. And then in the midst of this, you'll see on the next slide that we're seeing a rise of these experiences disproportionately among children of color. One of the things, there was a study that talked about the evidence of the rise of trauma experiences on the next slide. And it says, look, the suicide rate for Black males has increased by 47%. Black females, 59%, but it's decreased among white youth. So what does that say about what our kids are experiencing? Our kids of color, and there's again, 50% increase in the number of suicide attempts in the emergency department, right? The other thing that we're not talking about is over 140,000 children in the US have had the death of a caregiver, whether it's a parent or a grandparent, since the start of COVID. And if we think about it in relationship to kids from communities of color, that number increases to 4 to 5 times. So the amount of loss and disruption just from COVID has been significant, and that's trauma. And so how are we prepared to deal with that? And then John's going to continue to say this prevalence of trauma isn't going anywhere, right?
Okay. So I'm going to pick it back up, and I want to say thank you so much, Courtney. So appreciate your insight and your framing of this session. Such important information. I want to hit pause for a second. What immediate questions do you have? What is this making you think, feel? What's resonating with you? I've said it before, I have legendary wait time. I've got an hour of quiet in me. What do we got?
John, it's Christina and everyone else. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
I was just thinking that especially with the pandemic, it just seems as though everything that we've ever learned to help support people, kids, families who are going through trauma has been halted because there's a view that the risk of the health side of things, the physical health, is, I don't know, more of a priority. That might not be the best way to phrase that, but the trauma has always been there, and now we have more of it, and the supports that are used often to support it are being taken away because of COVID.
Yeah, it's certainly made for, but I guess let me see a show of hands from people. Access to services for kids, better or worse during the pandemic? Yeah, way worse. How about this? Has it been the case that we have always oriented to the well-being of kids first? Or have we sometimes trickled into attendance is important, academics is important? Oh my God, we got academics on overdrive. Have you seen that? Some of you? Seen a couple heads. I guess I'll say this. The reality is that, Christina, I appreciate your viewpoint. And I think this wasn't a problem. I mean, this isn't a new problem, right? Like, who saw mental health and trauma as a problem before the pandemic? Anybody? Oh, okay, everyone, right. So, I don't want to say like this is pandemic, the pandemic has caused this. The pandemic lit the dumpster on fire. It was already a problem. So we just now have to be all the more ready, all the more effective, all the more efficient, and really double down on these efforts because they're not going to get better. We've seen that. It's going to get way worse. So we got to do something about it. And that means a balance between preventative and reactive. Unfortunately, we still have to react to crisis. It's right in our face. We have to deal with what's in front of us right now, but we do have to get to preventative. We have to get to identifying the function of that behavior such that we can address it in a more proactive, preventative way, and I guess stem the tide of the onset of more serious mental health problems. Yeah.
And Christina, what I want to add is that there is one of the things we have to acknowledge is that there's a difference between survival and well-being, and they're not the same, right? If I'm focused on survival, I kind of throw well-being out the door and I'm just focusing on survival, right? Like, how do I keep you alive? I'm not focusing on how do I do it in a way that feels good for you and that heals you and that's healthy for you. And so one of the things I think we have to be conscious of is that we watch where the pendulum is swinging and we try to find that balance, right? Like where is the balance between survival and well-being? Because I think in the midst of being reactive, we'll just go towards survival and we'll forget about the well-being piece.
Some great comments in the chat. I appreciate that, Lisa. Kiara too. Am I saying that right, Kiara? I hope so. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. But this validation that that this is a slow burn trauma ongoing, and Erin pops in there that like we're in it too, right? Like we're not immune to the impact of this slow burn trauma, so we got to take care of ourselves too. I want to share some stats, some local stats, because I think sometimes there's some real meaning behind data that is coming out of our backyard. So we continue to screen for trauma throughout the pandemic. We have a universal screening program in Methuen that extends from K to 12. At the high school, we use a screening tool called the UCLA Brief COVID-19 Trauma Screen. And it's both a life event checklist related to COVID, and it's also a brief trauma screen. So looking at the effects of trauma and getting at post-traumatic stress. Who wants to take a stab at the percentage of students that scored in the moderate to severe range for post-traumatic stress at the high school? What do we think?
During the pandemic? Sorry, when you refer.
Yep, during the pandemic. Colleen offers 30%, Monique offers 30%. Ooh, geez, Crystal, I hope not. It's a lot, but scary. 45%, 45%, 50, okay. These are all good guesses. There's about 35 to 39% moderate to severe post-traumatic stress. I want to throw some other stats in the mix that will perhaps make sense too. We had about 37% of students score in the moderate to severe range on a measure of depression. About the same score in the range of moderate to severe on a measure of anxiety. And 17% of kids scored in the severe range across all three measures. So severely anxious, depressed, and experiencing post-traumatic stress. About 15% of our respondents in this past screening administration at the high school endorsed the question that they had thoughts of suicide and of hurting themselves. 15%. So I offer these stats not to be depressing. I offer them because I think we need to be real about what we're up against. I'm very glad that Crystal's wrong and it's not 80% of people. But at the same time, it's a lot of kids. It's a lot of kids that need our help. And if we don't orient to that real need, then it's not going to get any better. We can't wait for this to just get better on its own. So yeah, I offer that as a way to reflect. I'll also share this. I think sometimes when we talk about a heavy topic like trauma, there's this sense of dread talking about it. But I often share with people like, I love talking about trauma, and that sounds really weird. But the reason I love talking about trauma is because we, all of us, are so uniquely positioned to actually provide care to kids to address this very real need. So I am encouraged by the fact that we have upwards of 60 people in a room that said, you know what, I want to do something about that. So I really like talking about this topic and arming people with the knowledge and skills such that they can go back to their buildings and get down to the work of helping kids. So with that, let's get into a little bit more discussion around prevalence. You've probably been able to read these as I've been blathering along, but 50% of kids were assaulted at least once in the past year. Does that surprise anyone? No, Ruth's like, no, I see this. It's just the reality. It's unfortunate. About 20% of kids witness violence in their family or their neighborhood. About 10% suffered from child maltreatment, injured in an assault, or witnessed a family member assault another family member. Quick show of hands, thumbs up, thumbs down. Surprised? Not surprised. Not surprised. Yeah, this is your daily life now, right? You see this all the time. DCF, rates of filing 51As, through the roof. What about this? 2% of all children experience sexual assault or sexual abuse during the past year. Think of your building, 2%. Who here works in a high school? Got some high school folks. 11% of females aged 14 to 17 have experienced sexual assault, sexual abuse in the past year. 1 in 10. Awful. About 13% of children reported being physically bullied, about 33% emotionally bullied. I'd like to not breakout group it, but have some conversation about this. I'd love to hear some new voices. I'd like to hear some old voices. I'd like to hear some voices writ large. Is it likely that there are students in your classroom or school or office with whom you work with who have had traumatic experiences that you're unaware of? So first and foremost, let's pop in the chat. Is that a yes or a no? What do we think? I should see 60 yeses, right? Come on. Yup. Okay, well, how does that impact your practice? Let's think about this a little bit. In that there are individuals who are going to walk into your classroom, walk into your office. How does that impact your practice? What do you think? This is where you come off mute.
I'll talk. Yes, it goes back to that. You have to look at everyone as what has happened to you instead of what's wrong with you.
I love that, Julia. Like, come from it from a standpoint of like, you've had some experiences and I'm here to help. Cool. Kara, you came off mute. Don't think I didn't see that. What you got?
I teach health at Haverhill High, and we just happened to be talking about dating violence and relationships today. It actually surprises me that maybe that number should be slightly higher.
Okay.
We did some anonymous surveying today, and according to my kids, it should be slightly higher.
That's fair.
And we also talked about, actually, they had some great points today. Going back to Julia, what you said, like what, I'm sorry, how did you phrase it? What's happening to you? or what's happened to you.
Mhm.
They, I think how I phrased it was sort of on the reverse to see if anybody was listening. And they said, you know, Miss, everyone keeps blaming COVID, but wasn't this always really happening and nobody was talking about it?
Right.
So, I mean, it maybe took a little bit longer, but at least even the students are finally noticing and observing. You know, domestic violence calls, of course, we know everything is up allegedly, or was it always happening anyways, like we said. But for them to even notice and to even remark about it, I think for me is huge for my students to even comment out loud about it. So it was quite a moment today, and out of just pure accidental that we were having these conversations and one rolling into the other, and how people should be treating each other, and how everyone comes from a different place and different circumstances, and how they need to be more understanding. I don't know, just kind of rolled into one from the other, but I think their experiences can also help them be aware of other experiences. So they were helping me in that moment.
Yeah.
So
That's phenomenal. I appreciate the share and lots of insight there. You know, the fact that you're having students openly talk about these experiences, it makes me think too that like that is actively pushing against stigma. You know, we're trying to dismantle stigma, and that's one way of doing it. Let's put on the table this action. This is really happening, because one of the reasons why there's more traction now with providing care to kids in schools than pre-pandemic is because you can't look the other way. It's just everywhere. And it's not that it was not everywhere before, but like, again, it's on fire, and it is a crisis that needs to be addressed immediately. I'm going to argue it was a crisis before 100%, and shame on us, quite frankly, for not reacting to it sooner, but we're doing something about it. So thank you for that reflection, Kara. Anyone else have another reflection? How does this impact your practice? What does this make you think? Like, you might be working with students who have experienced some pretty significant trauma. Is that changing anything that you do? Stacy, I saw your note in the chat. You're assuming that all of your kids have a story, and maybe some aren't ready to share. That's okay, but that story's there.
I can talk. My name's Grace. Hi, everyone.
Hey, Grace.
Hi. So I'm a classroom teacher. I teach 5th grade, and I think just having taught like different grade levels now and taught for a few years, one of the things I've learned is that I think we talked about it in the beginning, that like capital trauma versus little t trauma. And I think I had such a specific way that I viewed trauma and like what that actually was, when in reality, I truly think, you know, my kids are young, so I don't know if they would be able to name what it is, but I think on some level, all of my students have experienced trauma, and I just kind of exist in that way when I teach, so that I just have like a hopefully naturally like trauma informed classroom, but that my students experience trauma in different ways, just based on like their identity, how they exist in the world, the way they've been raised, and like the way they have perspective. I think trauma looks different for all students, and the way that I even respond as a classroom teacher in a trauma-informed classroom is different dependent on like which child I'm addressing, because one way I interact with one child may not be the best strategy for like de-escalating or interacting with that child based on their specific type of trauma, whether I know what it is or not. I basically just use the relationships I have to try and gauge like what level do I need to meet you at in order to support you and make you feel seen and feel safe.
Love that. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Grace. Relationships. I mean, it's tough. Like it's kind of unfortunate actually. But when we say you gotta foster relationships, everyone like rolls their eyes. They're like, yeah, man, I know. But like that's the core of it. If you don't have that you don't have anything else. So none of these well-vetted evidence-based practices that we're going to talk about through this experience matter if you don't have a relationship with the kids in your classroom or your office or your school. So good call out, Grace. I appreciate that. I also want to call out Tara. Tara says, thinking more about tier 1 interventions. Here's a question for the group. I'd ask that you say yes or no in the chat. I'd like everyone to participate. Is trauma sensitive practices, or are trauma sensitive practices designed to be universally provided to all kids? Is trauma responsiveness a tier 1 universal practice or set of practices? I'm seeing lots and lots of yeses. Kara says, don't know. That's okay, Kara. We're going to get there. Should be lots of yeses. Yeah, this is the responsibility of everyone in the school. It's not the responsibility of a couple counselors up the hall. It's not the responsibility of the building admin only, or of the trauma team. It's the responsibility of every single staff member. We are all on the hook to be able to provide a trauma-sensitive environment for students to learn and to proactively avoid re-traumatization. That's it. So we'll talk about that in great detail when we get into the practices session, which is going to be, I want to say, the next session. I think, Ellie, you might be able to call this out. But we will get there. Right now, we need to give you a strong foundation in like what is trauma before we start to address like these trauma sensitive things. Kimberly offers, I appreciate what Grace was just saying, and it makes me think about how it might be important not to think about trauma experiencing as experiences that mark kids as having a deficit, but in fact learning about managing stress can be useful. No, Kimberly, that's okay. I love the point. Like, we don't have to look at this as a deficit. We can look at this as a life experience by which individuals can grow from it. Ruth, do you have something to offer?
I was just going to say something I've been thinking about a lot since last year is, we had both remote learning for a while and in-person learning. And I'm not talking about the stance of one or the other, but I saw certain kids who really benefited from being at home and other kids who didn't, right? And so that's another sort of, as kids are now in the building, some of them experienced trauma because they had benefited from being at home and now aren't connected with their families. And I've been trying to think about how to continue that relationship and that support of parents, grandparents, you name it, because that was vital for certain kids and other kids not. But it's just been on my mind how to create something for those families where that's there. Either the kids are worried about their families because they're not connected, or just that was a sense of they really made some major emotional awareness growth that they hadn't before. So how to make that connection continue.
Yeah, I like that. It's so tough because we're talking about this balance between like not putting kids in a situation where we're fostering avoidance or we're fostering a cycle of inactivity and isolation. Because for some of our kids, especially our students who are already exhibiting depressed symptoms, like, we put that on overdrive. We said, please be inactive and isolated. And that for sure did not benefit those students. But there are some students that, yeah, there was a sense of connection, there was a sense of relationship building with family. And do we want to take that away? Of course not, but we also don't want to foster avoidance. So how do we strike that balance? It's a good call on Ruth. Crisis and trauma allow for a chance to build resiliency within individuals and groups. Thanks for that. Appreciate that. Okay. Are we done with this discussion? This slide, you've stared at it long enough, yeah? So I appreciate all of the insights. I appreciate the engagement. Let's keep that going. But I guess at the end of the day, like, what I'm hearing is that it does impact your practice. You do have to think about it. You do have to take ownership of it. It's not something for someone else to address. It's something for all of us to take on. Fair comment? We good? Keep going? Okay. So some of you are probably familiar with this, but I want to go into, I think it's a really important piece to understand when we're talking about the onset of problems, when we talk about the onset of issues related to mental health, this idea of risk factors and protective factors. So what is a risk factor? It's a characteristic, biological, psychological, family, community, cultural, that precede and are associated with a higher likelihood of negative outcomes. Protective factors, think the opposite. They counter the onset of negative outcomes. So it's not any one thing that is going to lead to dysfunction. It is the confluence of protective and risk factors that ultimately determines whether or not an individual is going to experience a dysfunction and to what severity. We can't think of a single event as being the be-all, end-all. It's never any one thing. It's always the confluence of many different things that lead to ultimately an individual's experience. So we want to reduce the likelihood of risk factors. ACEs are some of those things, and we'll talk about what ACEs are. And we want to increase the likelihood that there are more protective factors. And your positive impact is a protective factor. That's just the reality. You, through your teaching, through your support, through your relationship building, your skill development for kids, that is all protective factor. Those are all protective factors that you can foster in your kids. And that does mediate the outcome. It does contribute to a decrease in the likelihood that there will be dysfunction. We can prevent stuff from happening. Any questions about risk and protective factors? Good. There's another way of looking at this. It's called the biopsychosocial perspective. And it's really just like, think of it like you have biological predisposition, you have psychological risk factors, you have social risk factors. Think of things like I don't have a social connection, I don't have a support network. Think of like I've gone through some stress in my life and I have a genetic predisposition to depression. Okay, it's the confluence of those three things that is going to result in dysfunction. Cool. This is the most sciencey, technical stuff we're going to talk about, but it's going to, I'm going to talk about it in a really like, I want to make this simple. So we're not going to talk about like the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. We're going to talk about the thinking brain and the feeling brain, or the emotional brain. So this idea of the stress response system is probably like the most foundational concept when we talk about trauma and how trauma happens. It's basically your brain's built-in alarm system. It's designed to detect potential threat and help us respond quickly to that threat to keep us safe. That's what it does. It goes through a series of steps. The typical stress response starts with the emotional brain sensing a threat and sounding an alarm that's sent to it sends a message to the body to react. This happens automatically. We don't get to choose this. We don't get to like set this in motion. It automatically happens, and that's really critical. So potential threat that we face, we react first and we think second. Critical concept right there. We react first, we think second. Courtney called this out several times when she was chatting with us. It is automatic, unconscious. We don't get to pick whether or not this happens. First two steps done. You with me? Friends, we're at like 3:55. You are approaching burnout. You got 35 minutes left in you? Come on, we're gonna get there. Step two, the thinking brain assesses the situation. We've oriented to a threat. We got to see whether it's real or a false alarm. So we're now in our thinking brain. We start with emotional brain, we're into thinking brain. What about next? If we confirm that the threat's real, our thinking brain goes offline, shuts down. Think about that funnel that Courtney talked about. We're now operating from an emotional standpoint. Our functional IQ is dropping off the map. Metacognitive skills are gone. We are now operating in a very reactive state. survival state. The emotional brain takes over, fight or flight begins. It's actually a 4-type typology. You've heard fight or flight, yes? We've heard freeze. Who here has heard of fawn? Let me get a yes or no in the chat. Have you heard of fawn as one of the reactions for trauma? The fight or flight, freeze or flight? No, almost nobody. Who's the overachiever? I saw yes. Alana, you're awesome. I like that. Erin too. So fawn is like, we're trying to acquiesce. We're trying to get the threat on our side, appease the threat. Does that make sense? Fight makes sense. Flight, get out of here. Freeze, don't do anything, let the threat pass. Fawn, acquiesce, try and get on the good side of the threat. You can imagine the kind of outcomes that would happen with that type of response. So when neither fighting or fleeing is an option moment, we may freeze, we may shut down. Typically, this goes well. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. The threat passes. The thinking brain helps to shut down the alarm system, that stress response. And the body puts the brakes on to allow us to calm down, come back into balance. So we sense a threat, we assess the situation, we respond, the thinking brain shuts it down once the threat passes. Does that make sense to people? This is the most technical, jargony stuff we're going to talk about. Give me a thumbs up if you're with me, if you followed along, because this is the critical piece of trauma, of understanding why trauma happens. So like, what happens when the threat doesn't pass? The experience becomes traumatic when it overwhelms our system for responding to stress. We tried to fight or flee. It didn't work. We tried to freeze. We tried to acquiesce. It didn't work. And we are left feeling helpless, vulnerable, out of control. We were not able to resolve the threat. Under these circumstances, the thinking brain doesn't take back over and shut down the alarm system. We stay in a state of hyperarousal. Our alarm system becomes overly sensitive to potential threat. We remain in that state. We stay in survival mode. And two things happen. We have now decreased the threshold for activation of the stress response system. So it's going to happen with threats that used to not be threats. We're going to designate things as potential threats even when we didn't before. And the sensitivity of the stress response system is going to increase. So it's going to happen more often and with less input. Our stress response cycle is going to start quickly, and it's going to be more acute. We're going to move to 11 real quick. And yes, that was a Spinal Tap reference for those of you in the crowd. All right. So right now, I need for you to understand that at the end of the day, when we're looking at behavior, there's a difference between behavior that is chosen or volitional behavior and a student's best attempt at keeping themselves safe, their stress response cycle. Does that make sense to people? What happens when we respond to a stress response with punitive, exclusionary discipline? What do you think? What happens when we tell a student, your best attempt at keeping yourself safe is going to get you punished? Re-traumatization, not good. Make it more likely for a stress response to occur. Thank you for that, Tara. Yep. Escalates behavior, validates fear. Yep. All of this is good. Yeah, I'm not going to ever bring this up, the traumatic event. Not meeting the function of the behavior, cause harm, increased dysregulation, all good stuff. Well, all bad stuff, but yes, all good answers. So that is at the core of our response. We have to understand the stress response system if we're going to enact change, enact practices that will adequately meet the needs of kids. Let's first, let me just check something. I want to see what we get for time and where I'm at in this. We are, okay, we're doing okay. We're doing okay. So symptoms of trauma, they look, I mean, trauma-related symptoms often look like other presenting problems. I want you to take a look at this, this image on the right. I want you to call out some other mental health problems that trauma looks like. What do you got?
ADHD.
Peggy, awesome. Well done. Yeah. Oppositional defiant disorder. Good call, Tara. What else? OCD, yep, potentially. Physical illness, thank you, Danielle. Avoidance, anxiety, depression, yeah. ODD, thank you, Kara. So like, this is one of the big issues, is that trauma looks like a lot of other stuff. And we often miss the fact that there's an underlying traumatic event that's driving behavior. So what do? Well, we might treat something else. We might address some other issue that might be there, might not be there. Because remember, you can have depression and post-traumatic stress side by side. But if we don't account for trauma in our approach, then we're going to miss the fact that we have to be sensitive to the stress response system. This is one of those, I got a bit ahead of myself. This is really that argument. We misdiagnose an awful lot. We maybe provide medication for ADHD. We maybe provide treatment for depression or anxiety, but we miss the trauma piece, and it's lacking in comprehension. We don't have a comprehensive approach to address the issues that our kids come to the table with. And that's super unfortunate. Okay, let's keep going. We want to get to a little bit of a discussion about the effects of trauma. So once this experience, or once this this event has been experienced and it has lasting adverse effects, what are those effects? What are the things that we're going to see? Impairment to memory, concentration, new learning and focus, lots of physical ailments, lots of impact on relationships. We're disrupting emotion identification, ability to self-soothe, coping skills. Not good. I'm realizing that we did not distinguish between ACEs and a trauma event. And that's really, really critical. So I want to take a hot minute and do that, because I think that at the end of the day, if we don't understand the difference between that, there's a lot of language out there around ACEs. By a quick show of hands, who here has heard of adverse childhood experiences? Lots of you, okay. So is an adverse childhood experience a trauma event? Are they the same thing? What do you think? Let me reframe. Can you have an adverse childhood experience that does not result in lasting adverse effect? Can you have an adverse childhood experience that does not result in lasting adverse effect? I'm seeing lots of yeses in the chat. Excellent. Good. You're right. Adverse childhood experiences are awful, and they occur at an alarming rate. I think I'm going to dig back into my memory that at least one adverse childhood experience, 60% of the population, I think that's right. If I'm wrong, it's still a big number. And when we're looking at 4 or more ACEs, I think, again, we're looking at like 11 to 13%. check my numbers for sure, but it's in that ballpark. No one wants a single ACE. Yeah, good call, Stacy. How adverse? It's case by case. And Megan, 100% star student Megan. It just increases the chances for behavior. It increases the chances. It's a risk factor, right? The more ACEs you have, the greater the potential for the experience of post-traumatic stress, but it does not equate to automatic post-traumatic stress. That's why we talk about risk factors and protective factors. So while we want to be sensitive to ACEs, because I think it paints a really clear picture of the degree to which we don't know about how much trauma or potential trauma there is out there, it's important to distinguish between a trauma event, which requires lasting adverse effects, and an ACE, which is a potential trauma, but we don't know yet. Does that distinction make sense to people? Okay. Good call out, Megan. I appreciate that. People who've experienced trauma are not in a good way when it comes to the likelihood of these things happening. About 15 times more likely to commit suicide. About 2.5 more times likely to smoke tobacco, 3 times more likely to experience depression. So these are effects that occur over the lifetime. And if we don't address these things, it's not like it just goes away. The reason for the ACEs study in the first place was to understand why these certain experiences were contributing to events that occurred well into an individual's adulthood. And the science is really clear, and the original Kaiser Permanente study was replicated many, many times. The reality is that when we have lots of ACEs, there's a greater likelihood that this kind of stuff happens. So the only way to combat that is by putting in protective factors in treatment, by ensuring that we are stemming the tide of risk factors as much as we can, and overloading and flooding kids with protective factors. And that means not re-traumatizing them. And that means ensuring that we are engaged in trauma-sensitive and trauma-responsive practices in the classroom and in counseling offices, and that we are adopting restorative disciplinary practices, not exclusionary disciplinary practices. So we're going to talk about all of those practice-driven things in an upcoming session. So stress response system is on overdrive now. Let's imagine a student that is in that heightened state of arousal. They are not able to turn off their alarm system as easily. It's now more sensitive. How does that translate into behavior? What does that look like? Hypervigilance, constantly scanning the environment for threats. Have we seen that? Have we seen students that are like constantly looking around, just checking, looking over their shoulder? That looks like ADHD, doesn't it? A little bit. Like they can't attend to the task at hand, but it's not. This is part of the stress response cycle. Hostile attributional bias, you're a threat until proven otherwise. How does that typically go with an authority figure? Great? Not really. Mistrust of authority figures, negative social interactions, aggressive or isolating behavior. Sometimes individuals display these types of behaviors and we respond with punishment. Doesn't go well. I think it's important to remember too that we're talking about changes in the structure and functioning of the brain. We're not talking about this is like physical changes to an individual's neurochemical makeup. This is not something they can turn on and off. We have to be sensitive to the fact that we are dealing with individuals that are, unfortunately, they have undergone such stress that this is not a choice they have to engage in this behavior. And it's almost tough because I almost don't even want to call it behavior. It's unfortunate because behavior has a negative connotation in schools. I almost want to say it's really unfortunate that these individuals have to engage in activities to keep themselves safe, or that they have to orient to safety so often as a function of their experiences. That to me paints a different picture than saying they behave in certain ways. Let's keep going. Impact of trauma on learning. So this is some of the why. Why should we orient to trauma? 2.5 times more likely to repeat a grade, 5 times more likely to have severe attendance issues, 6 times more likely to have behavioral problems, more than twice as likely to be suspended from school. Hey, I've got a question. What happens when you suspend a student? What are you ensuring for the future? Anybody in the chat? Come off mute.
Potentially more suspensions.
Yep. There's a much greater likelihood that we'll suspend them again, for sure. Yeah, we're also lots of good answers in the chat as well. Really important to recognize that there has to be some other response other than suspension. I want some thumbs up, thumbs down, activity on the screen or in the chat. Yes or no? Does suspension teach? Okay. No. Okay. Does suspension foster skill development? Okay. No. No. Lots of no's. Okay. Fair. What's the alternative? Kara, you rarely suspend. That's good. I guess the alternative that I would offer is that, yeah, restorative practices for sure. Regulation, relationship repair, lots of restoration. I appreciate that. I understand that schools can't stop suspending tomorrow, wholesale. I get that. I understand that. But I will say that we are operating from a very archaic disciplinary stance. And we do need to couple what we currently do with education and services and opportunities for restoration. Because as you all stated, pretty consistently, suspension doesn't teach, it doesn't restore, it doesn't provide skill development. It really is like putting a pin in an issue for a couple days. That issue returns if we don't address it. The time lapse did not result in any change. That make sense? Okay. Yeah, have involved parents for other alternatives. I appreciate that. Very good. Okay, we're rolling up toward the end. Before we get into secondary traumatic stress, I guess I want to say one piece before next session, because I know you're all going to interact with kids between now and our next session, which focuses on practices. And the one thing I would ask you to consider is this. Emotionally dysregulated students are not ready for punishment. Please remember that. It does not mean that punishment does not have to occur, because I understand that schools cannot toggle to using 0 exclusionary discipline practices overnight. But please, friends, emotionally dysregulated students are not ready for punishment. Think of the 4 R's that Courtney offered, right? We need to regulate, we need to relate, we need to restore. These are things that are incredibly important. I left off an R, but you know, you get the point. So, secondary traumatic stress. This is where we focus the conversation on all of you. The reality is that this is a reality for all of you. You work in one of the sectors in our world where you have more opportunity to be exposed to trauma from individuals that you service than almost all other professions. That's just the reality. So it becomes incredibly important to, one, understand what secondary traumatic stress is and to guard against it. It's this idea of trauma, secondary trauma, the trauma that individuals in your schools, your kids, your families experience. It's that cumulative effect of working with traumatized students and families that leads to negative changes in your views of yourself, others, the world. It causes increased difficulty leaving work at work. I'm not going to ask you to show for a show of hands on this, but I'd ask you to reflect. I'm going to go through this list and I want you to think to yourself, like, is this a thing for me? Is this happening with me? Increased difficulty leaving work at work, increased irritability of coworkers and students, diminished energy and patience. I'm seeing some of you micro nod. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Doubts about professional capabilities and impact. Questions about the value and purpose of the work. This sometimes is a function of working with students who've experienced trauma, working with families who've experienced trauma, and the weight of all of that all day long. Oh, and by the way, you have your own stuff going on. It can extend into your personal life. It can affect you. I have an answer. It's not a complete answer, but it's a free answer, and you like free. So the STAT program, show of hands, anyone hear about this? Yes or no in the chat? Stick with me, friends. You got 12 minutes left and then you're gone. No, 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 no. Lots of no's. Okay. So the STAT program, so it's support for teachers affected by trauma. This was designed for educators. It's 5 online modules. It's going to talk to you about what secondary traumatic stress is, the risk factors associated with it. It's going to give you tangible self-care skills across multiple life domains. Super user-friendly, does not take a ton of time, and it's free. Completely free. We offer this to our staff. It's not something that they need to like go to an administrator and get a login. It can be completely confidential. So if you're interested in this, and I can see people starting to write down this this URL, you will get the slides as well, just so you can reference back. But I would strongly recommend it. Like, how difficult would it be for one of you to draft an email and say, hey, I heard this incredibly compelling speaker today. His name was John. No, come on, cut that out. And he offered this solution to secondary traumatic stress. STAT program, it's free. You might want to check it out. At least get some awareness around it. We offer this to our staff in kind of like a book club without the book, like unpack each module together and talk about it. I think that's a nice way to approach it, but you can do this on your own too. I've had staff go through it. One staff member cruised through in an hour and a half. I don't know if that was like, I don't know if that was a super meaningful experience, but gives you a little bit of a sense of like, this isn't, we're not talking about a 12-hour course here. Make sense? Got to do something about it, right? You gotta be aware of it, if anything. There's a resource page that I had, and I can send it out with but it has some nice links to some resources around self-care. And we're rolling up on the end. I wanna make sure that we are orienting to what's next. We started this discussion actually a few weeks back. Who here, yes in the chat, was at the session on the trauma responsive TRSIA, the assessment tool for trauma responsiveness in the SHAPE system. Monique was here. Trauma responsive schools inventory assessment. All right, Jamie's here, cool. So we actually started that. That's going to be a tool that we use to build an action plan, a trauma responsive action plan for your school or district. You watched the video, that's cool. Well done. This session really was meant to ground you in an understanding about what trauma is, how it happens, why it happens, the stress response cycle, the impact on kids, why you need to care about it, and a little bit of what you can do to help yourself. As we move forward, we're going to have 4 more sessions. They're all up here. Ellie just dropped a survey in the chat, which is going to help us to understand how we did. I hope we did well. I hope you got something out of today. We really love your feedback, so I hope you'll complete that in the next couple of minutes. So next session, we're going to focus on trauma-informed, healing-centered supports across tiers, part 1. And we're going to focus on classroom and universal supports and interventions. We're going to bust out the trauma-sensitive classrooms strategy guide. And we're going to go through some activities to foster trauma sensitivity for all of you in the classroom. We'll then get into, and someone's writing on my slides, which is ridiculous. You're tagging up my slides. I can't even believe you. I don't even know who it is. I would shame you if I could. That is not a trauma responsive practice, tagging up slides. We will then go into trauma-informed healing centered supports across tiers part 2. So that's going to be like, think evidence-based counseling services, evidence-based therapeutic care, think TFCBT, CBT. We're going to talk about group-based and individual services. We'll talk about teaming, screening, and data. I mentioned trauma screening today. We'll talk about that in great detail. And then we're going to talk about supporting educators in establishing a trauma-informed, healing-centered school culture, because you all matter a ton too. So again, please fill out the feedback survey. I want to hit pause, and like we've gone through an awful lot. And look, at your tagging of my slides has trickled onto the next slide as well. So congratulations. I hope you feel really proud of yourself. You didn't even write anything pithy or cool. You just drew some lines. So what you should expect in the future is that you're gonna get contacted by a Thriving Minds rep, your coach, and you're gonna set up your first connecting coaching session, and you will make arrangements for an initial self-assessment using the TRSIA. We're really excited to be here with you. Want to make sure that I orient you to the Rennie Center website, which has all kinds of information on Thriving Minds, and make sure you sign up for more sessions in the future. And a super big thank you from the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma, who again funded this, and who are our sponsors for this activity. So I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute. We've got like 5 minutes left. Please complete the feedback survey, but I'd love to hear from all of you. What questions do you have?